Probably the most important thing to know about place phrases is where or when to put them in your German sentence. In English, we encounter them fairly early on in the sentence. I might say, for example, I walked to uni today. You can see that the place phrase comes before the time phrase. In German, it's actually one of the last things you need in a sentence, at least if you follow this basic pattern. If you're talking about yourself, then you'll probably start with ich as your subject and immediately drop in a verb that says what you are doing. And then we might encounter the word gern if you want to let people know that you like doing whatever the verb says that you're doing. And then we'll have all of those other often adverbial phrases like when and how, and then right before we get to the object, if our sentence has one, we'll squeeze in a place phrase. Of course, you can move things around and start with pretty much any of these elements if you want to emphasize something in particular. You could do this, or even this. But our basic sentence structure is this. So let's break it down and see how we express the idea of place in German. First, we need to know that there are three main types of place phrases, and these are the answers to questions that start with woher, wo, and wohin. If we're asking woher, then we're interested in origins, where we have come from. Wo is perhaps the simplest idea of the lot, since it is interested in the location of something, or in other words, where that something is. Whereas wohin is more concerned with any movement towards a destination. Descriptions of location are expressed in the dative, so we'll come back to these in another video and just concentrate today on expressing the idea of going places, because as you'll see, there's quite enough to think about here as it is. And this is perhaps also the information that we communicate the most. Even if I were to ask you, was machen Sie am Wochenende? You're more likely to answer by talking about the places that you're going to go to rather than saying where you will be. And here, it's important to realize that in English, we often just use the same word where in both situations. Where are you? And where are you going? To express these ideas in German, we need to recognize that in the second example, we're really trying to find out where you are going to. So your answer will contain information about movement towards some destination or other. In German, we have to use two different question words to express these ideas, wo or wohin. And in providing an answer, there are differences too. In English, we pretty much always use the word to refer to our destinations. I'm going to work, to the beach, to the library, to the supermarket. It doesn't really matter where we're going to. We always just use the preposition to introduce our destination, but not so in German. If you look this preposition up in a dictionary, then you'll find a long list of confusing options. So let's simplify things. Although you could use any one of these prepositions, zu, in, auf, an, and nach, to introduce our destinations, there are three main ones that we'll need: nach, in, and zu. Let's start with the easiest of all, nach. And we've come across this before in a couple of different contexts. For example, telling the time, where we might say, es ist 10 nach 7. But used with specific destinations, it takes on a different meaning. You might be familiar with sentences like this: Ich gehe jetzt nach Hause. This means I am going home, or perhaps I am going to my house. nach Hause. Oh, future me here. If you're thinking to yourself, why is there an E on the end of Haus? Surely the word doesn't have an E on the end. Well, you'd be right. This is a hangover from old Middle High German grammar where the neuter and masculine singular nouns in the dative got an extra E, which is why we occasionally hear people say am Fuß des Berges, im Laufe der Woche, and ich bin zu Hause. So yes, old grammar. So we use nach when we are going to our own house or home, nach Hause, but we also use it in 3 other situations. If you're going to a city, a country, or even a continent, you'll use nach. And here are a couple of simple examples. Im Sommer fahren wir oft nach Sydney. Nächstes Jahr fliegen wir wieder nach Österreich. Er zieht nach Europa. Well, our next preposition is one that you might not immediately find if you're looking up the word to in the dictionary, but this is a form that we use a lot. And this is the preposition in. And it's a simple one to use because we don't need to use any fancy dative or anything like that. We just use the accusative, which makes sense because if we are the ones who are going somewhere, then we are already the subjects. So it makes sense for our destination to be in the accusative. So when do we use it? Well, are you going into a building or some kind of enclosed space? Then you'll use in. Are you going there to do something for a fair bit of time? Then you'll use in. You'll often be going there too for an experience rather than just some routine task. Okay, some examples. I'm thinking of maybe things like going to the pub or a restaurant, the theatre, the cinema, or going to a library, a bookshop, a lecture, a school, or a museum maybe. That kind of thing. And in each case, we are ending up inside a building or an enclosed space for a particular reason or experience and for a reasonable amount of time. And since all of these places have a gender, we need to be careful with our adjectives. And luckily, many of these places are, oddly enough, feminine. So you could say, ich gehe in die Kneipe. Ich gehe in die Stadt. Ich gehe in die Bibliothek. Ich gehe in die Vorlesung. And from these examples, it's clear that all the places are feminine. Feminine places where you end up inside a building or, in the case perhaps of the city, inside an enclosed space or a bounded area. Now, many other common places where you might go to are neuter, like the cinema or the movie theatre, where you'd say, ich gehe in das Kino. Of course, in examples like this, we're more likely to say ins. Ich gehe ins Kino, which is a proper word and not just slang. And there are quite a few other places that are neuter as well. Ich gehe ins Kino. Ich gehe ins Restaurant. Ich gehe ins Café. Ich gehe ins Museum. Ich gehe ins Theater. And so on. In each case, it's clear that you're talking about places where you're going to be spending a good bit of quality time. You'll be inside and not just hanging around outside or quickly nipping in to grab something and coming back out. And as we've seen, many of them are feminine or neuter. Oddly enough, there aren't many common examples of masculine places where you'd spend time in the same way, except maybe the park where you'd use in den, since the place phrase is an object of sorts and our masculine object article is den rather than der. For example, ich gehe in den Park. Okay, but not every destination is somewhere where you want to spend a whole lot of time. Maybe it's not even somewhere where you can end up inside a building or in an enclosed space. Or maybe it is a building, but you don't intend spending much time in it. Well, this is where we have to use a new preposition, zu. Again, the gender of the place will be important. If the place you're going to doesn't have an article, then you can just use the preposition all by itself. And this happens most often if you're using the name of a shop, a cafe, or the name of someone whose place you're going to. In these cases, we can say, ich gehe zu H&M, ich gehe zu McDonald's, ich gehe zu Simon und Tina. But most of the time, we would normally use an article. But the good news is we mostly include this as part of the preposition. And the only thing we need to know here is if our destination is feminine or not. And here's how it works. If the place we're going to is feminine, then we use zur. And if it's not, we use zum. We'll learn what this is all about when we start work on the dative in a couple of weeks' time. But for now, we just need to remember zur if the place is feminine, zum if it's not. And since these words actually already include an article, we don't need to add in another one, since both zur and zum already mean to the. So it makes sense to say, ich gehe zur Post, if I'm going to the post office. Ich gehe zur Uni, if I'm going to the uni. Ich gehe zur Bank, if I'm going to the bank. Ich fahre zur Tankstelle, if I'm going to the petrol station. Each of these places are feminine, so we're using zur. And although, yes, they are buildings, with zur we're indicating that we're just going there to carry out some kind of routine task, and we're not going to be spending an extended amount of time there. And it sounds like you're probably just going to dash in, pick up a parcel, maybe fill up your car, or maybe just withdraw some cash, that sort of thing. This may not seem to make sense in the case of the university, but we're thinking of the university in this situation, not just as a building, but as a series of buildings on a campus. So you might not necessarily be going into one particular building, you're just expressing the idea that you are going to the university campus. And it's the same thing with masculine or neuter places, like, say, the supermarket. It's masculine, so we're going to use zum rather than zur. Here we could say, ich gehe zum Supermarkt. Ich gehe zum Strand. Or ich fahre zum See. In these examples, it is perhaps clear why we're using zum and not some form of the preposition in. Can you see why this is? There's a big and actually expensive difference between ich fahre zum See and ich fahre in den See. And similarly, it's possible to say ich gehe zum Kino rather than ich gehe ins Kino. But with zum, it doesn't sound like you're going to be spending much time there. You're not necessarily going there for the experience of watching a movie. Instead, you might just be grabbing some movie tickets. Or we might use zum when we're driving to the movies. Ich fahre zum Kino. And this makes much more sense than saying ich fahre ins Kino, since that sort of thing is probably illegal. You won't be driving into the cinema. And similarly, you'll mostly be saying ich gehe in die Kneipe. But what difference would it make if we used zu instead? Well, let's find out. Kneipe is feminine, so we'd say ich gehe zur Kneipe. This sort of implies that you're going to the pub and you will then be at the pub. Maybe you're just waiting for somebody outside, but you're not necessarily going inside the pub. Or if you are going in, then you're not necessarily intending staying there particularly long. But let's try a different example. I've suggested using zu for going to the supermarket. So we'd say, ich gehe zum Supermarkt. But is it wrong to use in instead? Well, the supermarket is masculine, so we'd say, ich gehe in den Supermarkt. This is fine, but it expresses the idea that you are going into or entering the supermarket. It's concerned with that moment you go through the door rather than your trip to the supermarket. So while we can use either zu or in, the meaning will be subtly different each time. Okay, now I'm going to show you some pictures of destinations, and your job will be to come up with the appropriate place phrase. Is it zu, in, or nach? I'll give you the start of the sentence, and it will be your job to complete the sentence with an appropriate place phrase. Am Samstag gehen wir gern. Am Wochenende fahren wir. Morgen gehen wir. Am Samstag geht sie. Wir gehen jetzt. Der Hund geht gern. Ich gehe. Wir gehen. Well, I hope that went okay. Here are some possible answers. And remember, Übung macht den Meister. So head over now to your textbook Bausteine EINS and work your way through Part C, Struktur, and then try some of the Übungen für Kapitel 10. Und so, das war's dann für heute und für diese Woche. Ich wünsche dir eine schöne Woche und wie immer, wenn du Fragen hast, schreib sie unten in die Kommentare. Alles Gute, auf Wiedersehen und tschüss.